So essentially, when the British came, right, they realized two things. One, that the people that were already here, because I would say legend has it that all original people of Jamaica died out or were destroyed by the Spanish. This was not true. So essentially, when they got here, they realized that people were here, indigenous people were here, and those people had their own spirituality. Also, as most people know, they had their so-called transatlantic slave trade, where they were bringing Africans from the continent into Jamaica, Barbados, etc. Both the people who they found here and the Africans who later joined them, who were brought here, both had their own spiritual power. So essentially, when those peoples came together, which was something that the British did not anticipate, they melded their two versions of spiritual practice. And what happened, what ensued, which people call Obeah, the right name for it is Myal, Myal being the traditional religion of Jamaica. The British realized was a very powerful force. And eventually, as time progressed and the British established their plantations, etc., they had priests of different nations that they brought as slaves as well. And so eventually the British realized that in order to have any kind of protection here from those who were resisting them, who were fighting them, they had to consult priests of the same religion or the same spiritual background. So essentially, the British had spiritual practitioners on their plantations that they used to consult if they wanted to know the future, if they wanted especially help with tropical diseases, because all indigenous priests are by necessity herbal healers and spiritual healers. So essentially, when they were met with diseases that they did not know, they were unfamiliar with, that they didn't understand, they had to consult the priests of traditional religion. So that's where the first set of consultation came in, where British people were seeking help from traditional priests. Because, you know, malaria, dengue, all of these various tropical diseases that the British had no knowledge of, traditional priests knew how to heal them. Also, what people don't know is that the British soon fell in love with their slaves, essentially. They soon fell in love with the natives and the Africans, etc. And of course, the women would have been trying to avoid them. Many of those ancestral females had their own husbands, had their own families. And so the British had to find ways to force them into relationships with them. So they would go to the Obeah man, the Obeah priest, the Myal priest, to tie them, to bring them into love with them, right? Something very similar to what we're used to today. And the next dimension of it is that you had people in the mountains, who everyone knows as Maroons today, that were using different levels of warfare, be it spiritual warfare or physical warfare, to resist the British colonial oppression. And so the British found themselves consulting other priests in order to get help, to get assistance, to get advice on how to deal with Maroon spiritual attacks, essentially. So it brings us to the question, if Obeah is not real, and if the British believe that their Christian God and their Christian religious construct was all-powerful, why did they outlaw Obia and Myal? Well, it's pretty simple. The main reason is they realized that these spiritual traditions brought our people together. It was a unifying factor. It was something that everybody could get behind. So even if you had new people coming in on the slave ships, when they came and they met with priests, etc., they could find common ground, because really and truly spirituality, the spirit world is one. The differences are cultural in the languages that we use to speak about spirit, etc. So even people from other nationalities could unify under that spiritual banner. So quickly, they passed a law in 1760, and this was after what is called Tacky's Rebellion or Tacky's War, which Tacky was just a war general. Tacky was not the originator of that war against colonial oppression. It was actually a plan by the indigenous priests of the land, joining with the African priests who were coming in, who said, we need to continue the fight, which was already started by Nani, Kodjo, all of those people. So the British realized that it was the Myal priesthood that was blessing the warriors, giving them hope and motivation, and giving them certain baths, spiritual baths to take, and certain amulets, necklaces, and things to wear to protect themselves from Bakra or from the white man, as they would say. So right after that war, which I like to call the Myal War, the British passed a law which was called an Act to Remedy the Evils Arising from Irregular Assemblies of Slaves. So if we listen to the title of that law, we know right away that this was a law against indigenous and African unity. They didn't want us to unify, because if we unify, we're stronger together. And so it was very important to get rid of that unity. Later on now, when slavery was abolished, the British still had a problem with Jamaican traditional religion, because they still wanted to oppress the people, control the land, and have our people working for them. So they created the Obia Act in 1898, because since slavery had been abolished, they could no longer say an act to remedy the evils arising from irregular assemblies of slaves, because these people were no longer slaves. And so this act was still very far-reaching, very repressive. You could have been arrested without trial under this act. You could have been exiled off of the island of Jamaica to places like Cuba and Honduras under this act. And you could even be executed, hung, because of this act. And this act didn't just encompass what people call Obeah, which in most people's minds they would consider to be evil witchcraft, but all of Jamaica's traditions. So even barnyard healers in the revival tradition, normal herbal healers that were just helping the people in their communities, even Howellites, Garveyites, Rastas. And this is why in the beginning Rastas were called Black Art Man, which they later called Black Heart Man, but it's really Black Art Man, because Rastas were coming out of the Myal religious tradition. And so they were very deep mystics, always have been. And so Rastafari was originally moving along the vein of colonial resistance, resistance against colonization that the ancestors in the Myal tradition had begun. And so even they suffered under the Obia Act. Anybody who was practicing traditions suffered because of the Obia Act.